The moment someone questions your character in front of your family, they are not looking for an answer. They are hoping your silence will become their victory. That was exactly what my cousin believed would happen the afternoon our entire family gathered for my aunt's 75th birthday. Instead, one calm sentence changed the direction of the conversation and, in ways none of us could have predicted, changed the course of our relationship for the next year. The party had all the familiar signs of another happy family reunion. Folding tables stretched across the backyard beneath strings of white lights. Children chased each other between the maple trees while older relatives compared stories about retirement, fishing trips, and grandchildren. My aunt insisted on making her famous peach cobbler, even though everyone offered to help, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the warm June air. If someone had walked into that backyard without knowing us, they would have seen nothing but smiles, laughter, and the comfortable rhythm of a family that had gathered together for decades. I wish that had been the whole story. My name is Nathan Carter, and my cousin Ryan Mitchell and I grew up almost like brothers. Our mothers were sisters, our fathers worked together for years, and every major holiday, birthday, graduation, and family vacation included both of us. We built tree forts in my grandparents' backyard, spent summers fishing at the same lake, and competed over everything from baseball games to who could finish a slice of watermelon first. Whenever relatives talked about one of us, they usually mentioned the other in the very next sentence. Nobody imagined that one day we would become the two people making everyone else uncomfortable at family gatherings. Looking back, I cannot point to one dramatic event that pulled us apart. There was no betrayal, no argument that lasted through the night, no shocking secret waiting to be uncovered. Life simply carried us in different directions. Ryan built a successful construction business and earned a reputation for working harder than almost anyone else I knew. I chose a different path. After years of volunteering in community organizations, mentoring younger professionals, and helping local charities organize fundraising events, people gradually began asking me to serve on nonprofit boards and neighborhood committees. I never chased those opportunities. They simply appeared because someone trusted me enough to recommend my name. At first, Ryan congratulated me every time another responsibility came my way. He joked that I collected volunteer positions the same way other people collected golf clubs. We laughed together because nothing about it felt competitive. At least, that was how I saw it. Somewhere over the following years, something invisible changed. I noticed little things before I understood what they meant. Whenever relatives thanked me for organizing a charity event, Ryan immediately changed the subject. Whenever someone asked me for advice about a community project, he quietly walked away to refill his drink. During family dinners, compliments directed toward me seemed to leave him unusually quiet. None of those moments lasted more than a few seconds, and each one was easy to ignore by itself. Together, however, they formed a pattern I did not recognize until much later. My wife, Emily, noticed long before I did. On the drive home after one Thanksgiving dinner, she looked out the passenger window before saying something that stayed with me for months. "Your cousin does not seem upset with you," she said carefully. "He seems upset with the way other people look at you." I laughed because the idea sounded impossible. Ryan had always been confident, outgoing, and respected by everyone in our family. Why would he care about the attention anyone else received? Emily simply shrugged. "Sometimes people are not competing for success," she replied. "Sometimes they are competing for significance." I remember dismissing her observation because it sounded too complicated for what I believed was happening. I assumed Ryan was just having a stressful year. Business owners carried heavy responsibilities, and everyone reacted differently under pressure. I never imagined that ordinary conversations could slowly become measurements of value. The birthday celebration seemed to begin like every other family event. My father was telling one of his old stories that everyone had already heard at least 5 times. Yet we all laughed anyway, because watching him enjoy telling it mattered more than hearing the ending. My aunt opened gifts while cousins passed paper plates filled with food across the tables. Children took turns trying to hit a baseball farther than their parents. It was peaceful, comfortable, and completely familiar. Then someone asked whether I would be helping organize the annual neighborhood food drive again that fall. Before I could answer, another relative smiled and said, "If Nathan is involved, you already know everything will be well organized." Several people nodded in agreement. I thanked them politely and tried to move the conversation somewhere else. That was when Ryan slowly set down his glass, looked directly at me across the table, and asked the question that silenced the entire backyard. His voice was calm enough that nobody could accuse him of causing a scene, yet every word landed with unmistakable weight. He asked why anyone would trust me. Every conversation stopped. Forks paused halfway to plates. Even the children seemed to sense that something important had just happened. I met Ryan's eyes without feeling angry. More than anything, I felt surprised. This was not the cousin who had spent half his childhood standing beside me through scraped knees, failed science projects, fishing trips, and late summer baseball games. I took one slow breath before answering with the only response that felt completely honest. They already do. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not point toward awards, volunteer work, or recommendations. I simply stated a fact that everyone in that backyard already understood. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been because, for the first time, every member of our family realized this was never really about trust. It was about something much deeper that none of us had been willing to see until that single quiet moment forced us all to look. Nobody said another word for what felt like an entire minute after Ryan's question echoed across my aunt's backyard. The only sounds came from the soft breeze moving through the maple trees and the distant laughter of younger children who were too busy playing to notice the sudden silence surrounding the adults. My aunt slowly set her fork beside her plate. My mother looked down at the tablecloth as though she hoped the uncomfortable moment might disappear if nobody acknowledged it. My father leaned back in his chair without saying anything, studying both Ryan and me with the patient expression that had carried him through decades of family disagreements. I remained standing beside the picnic table, surprised less by what Ryan had asked than by the fact that he had finally said it out loud. Looking back now, I realized that question had not been born that afternoon. It had been growing quietly for years. Emily reached over and gently touched my hand beneath the edge of the table. She did not say anything because she knew me well enough to understand that I needed a moment to think before speaking again. That simple gesture reminded me of something important. Trust had never been built through dramatic speeches. It had always been built through hundreds of ordinary moments that most people forgot almost as soon as they happened. My aunt finally broke the silence by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate her birthday. Her voice was warm, but noticeably softer than before. Conversations slowly restarted, although nobody returned to the easy laughter that had filled the yard earlier. People chose safer subjects. Someone asked about the weather forecast for the following week. Another cousin complimented the peach cobbler. My father began telling Ethan how to bait a fishing hook before their next weekend trip. Everyone tried to help the afternoon move forward, yet the question Ryan had asked remained sitting quietly at the center of every conversation. A little later, while several relatives carried empty, serving dishes into the kitchen, I stepped toward the edge of the backyard to refill my glass with iced tea. I was not trying to avoid anyone. I simply wanted a few minutes away from curious eyes. As I stood there watching sunlight reflect across the small pond behind my aunt's property, memories began returning one after another. Ryan and I had once shared everything. We learned to ride bicycles on the same cracked sidewalk. We spent entire Saturdays building forts from old pieces of lumber behind my grandfather's garage. During one summer vacation, we convinced ourselves we could build a raft strong enough to cross the small lake near our campground. It floated for less than 30 seconds before sinking beneath both of us, and our parents laughed so hard they could barely help us back to shore. Those memories never included competition. Back then, if one of us succeeded, the other celebrated too. Somewhere between childhood and middle age, life quietly replaced comparison with cooperation, and then, almost without warning, cooperation drifted back toward comparison again. Emily joined me near the pond carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to me before speaking softly enough that nobody else could hear. "Are you all right?" she asked. I nodded after a long pause. "I think so." She studied my face for a moment. "You do not seem angry." I smiled faintly. "That is because I do not think Ryan was really asking about me." Emily understood immediately. "You think he was asking something about himself?" I looked back toward the family gathered beneath the trees. Ryan was helping my uncle fold extra chairs as though nothing unusual had happened. From a distance, he looked completely relaxed. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I think he has been carrying something much heavier than I realized." Emily rested her hand gently against my shoulder. Sometimes people ask painful questions because they are hoping someone else will answer the ones they cannot ask themselves. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Before leaving the party, Ryan and I crossed paths near the driveway. For a brief second, I considered stopping him to talk, but the expression on his face told me he was not ready. He gave me a polite nod, loaded a cooler into the back of his truck, and drove away without looking back. There was no shouting, no dramatic ending, and no final confrontation. Somehow that felt even more unsettling. On the drive home, I kept replaying the entire afternoon in my mind. I searched for the exact moment when everything between us had begun changing, but every memory led to another ordinary day instead of one defining event. The truth was far more complicated. Relationships rarely fall apart because of one conversation. More often, they change through dozens of unnoticed moments when assumptions quietly replace honest questions. After nearly 20 minutes of silence, Emily looked out the passenger window and said something I would remember for the next several months. When people stop believing there is enough respect for everyone, they begin treating respect like something that has to be taken from somebody else. I glanced toward her before returning my eyes to the road ahead. "Do you think that is what happened?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I think your cousin stopped seeing your success as something separate from his own value." That possibility had never crossed my mind. I had always assumed trust could grow without taking anything away from anyone else. I believed there was room for every person in our family to be respected in different ways. As the miles passed beneath the tires, I began wondering whether Ryan had spent years believing exactly the opposite. For the first time since that afternoon began, I stopped asking myself why he had questioned me. Instead, I started wondering what had convinced him that someone else's trust automatically meant less remained for him. The days after my aunt's birthday passed with an uncomfortable kind of quiet that lingered longer than I expected. Nobody called to discuss what had happened, yet everyone seemed aware that something important had shifted beneath the surface of our family. My mother phoned me 2 evenings later to ask how Emily was doing and whether we had finally planted the tomato seedlings in our backyard. She spoke with the same warmth she always had, but I noticed she carefully avoided mentioning Ryan or the gathering. That silence told me more than any direct question could have. Families often convince themselves that avoiding difficult conversations keeps the peace. In reality, it usually allows small misunderstandings to grow into permanent assumptions. Emily noticed the change almost immediately. Every Sunday afternoon, we normally drove to my parents' house for coffee, but that week everyone politely claimed to be busy. Claire texted to say she needed to finish a project for work. My uncle decided to go fishing. My aunt wanted to rest after the birthday celebration. None of those reasons sounded unreasonable by themselves, yet together they created an unusual emptiness. For years our family had looked for excuses to spend more time together. Suddenly, everyone seemed to be finding reasons to spend a little less. One evening, while Emily and I were walking through the neighborhood after dinner, she slipped her hand into mine and asked the question I had quietly been avoiding. "When was the last time you and Ryan actually spent time together without the rest of the family around?" I thought about it longer than I expected. We still saw each other during holidays, birthdays, and reunions, but those gatherings always revolved around everyone else. It had probably been 3 years since we had shared lunch together or gone fishing like we used to. That realization surprised me because, growing up, we had rarely gone a week without seeing each other. Life had not separated us through one dramatic disagreement. It had simply filled our calendars until familiarity quietly became distance. As we continued walking beneath the streetlights, I found myself remembering the version of Ryan that had shaped so much of my childhood. He was the cousin who taught me how to throw a football with enough confidence that I finally made the middle school team. He stayed late helping me rebuild my first car after the engine failed during college. When my grandfather passed away, Ryan stood beside me through the entire service without saying very much because he understood that some moments needed presence more than words. Those memories refused to fit the picture of the man who had challenged me in front of our relatives. The more I thought about them, the more convinced I became that something had changed inside him long before anything changed between us. A week later, I attended a monthly meeting for the local community food pantry where I had volunteered for nearly 8 years. The meeting itself was ordinary. We reviewed donation numbers, planned the fall fundraising schedule, and discussed repairs that the building needed before winter. At the end of the meeting, one of the newer volunteers approached me with a folder full of notes. She smiled nervously before asking if I could review her proposal because, in her words, everyone says you always make people feel heard. I thanked her and agreed to help, but while driving home I kept thinking about that sentence. She had not complimented my experience or my ideas. She had spoken about how people felt after talking with me. Trust, I realized, had never come from having perfect answers. It had grown from showing up consistently, listening carefully, and keeping promises that many people would consider too small to matter. I had never viewed those habits as remarkable because my parents had raised me believing they were simply part of being dependable. That evening, I shared the conversation with Emily while we prepared dinner together. She smiled as she sliced vegetables for the salad. "Do you know why people trust you?" she asked. I shrugged. I have never really thought about it. She looked at me with quiet certainty. Because they never have to guess which version of you is going to walk through the door. Her words stayed with me because they felt unexpectedly true. Whether I was helping organize a neighborhood event, visiting relatives, or volunteering on a Saturday morning, I had always tried to treat people the same way. Not because I expected recognition, but because consistency made life simpler. I suddenly wondered whether Ryan believed trust worked differently. Perhaps he thought it depended on popularity, influence, or public praise instead of ordinary reliability practiced over many years. A few days later, my father stopped by our house carrying a small toolbox. He wanted help replacing a broken latch on the gate separating our backyard from the alley. We worked side by side for nearly an hour before he finally leaned against the fence and wiped his hands on an old shop towel. "Your cousin has been under a lot of pressure," he said without looking directly at me. I paused, surprised that he had brought up Ryan without any prompting. "Did he tell you that?" I asked. My father nodded slowly. "Business has been difficult. Several projects were delayed, and he feels responsible for everyone who works for him." I listened quietly while tightening the final screw into the new latch. My father continued in the calm voice that had always made even complicated situations feel manageable. "Sometimes people carry worries for so long that they begin seeing competition where none exists." I looked across the yard at the newly repaired gate swinging smoothly on its hinges. Until that moment, I had focused almost entirely on what Ryan had said. For the first time, I began wondering what kind of weight he had been carrying before he ever opened his mouth at my aunt's birthday. That question stayed with me long after my father drove away, and the more I considered it, the less interested I became in defending myself, and the more determined I became to understand the story Ryan had been living without anyone else noticing. By the end of July, our family had settled into an unusual routine that nobody openly discussed. Birthdays were still celebrated, weekend cookouts still happened, and the group text remained active with photographs of grandchildren, vacation snapshots, and reminders about upcoming reunions. Yet underneath every friendly exchange lived an invisible hesitation. People had become careful. They measured their words before speaking, laughed a little less freely, and instinctively changed the subject whenever Ryan and I happened to stand near each other. Nobody wanted another uncomfortable afternoon, even though no one truly understood what had caused the first one. I kept thinking about what my father had said while we repaired the backyard gate. Sometimes people carry worries for so long that they begin seeing competition where none exists. The more I reflected on those words, the more I realized they described something much larger than my relationship with Ryan. Our entire culture often treated recognition as though there were only so much of it available. If one person received appreciation, someone else quietly wondered whether there was any left for them. I had never believed respect worked that way, but perhaps Ryan had spent years feeling exactly that. One Saturday morning, I volunteered at the neighborhood community center where a group of us organized backpacks filled with school supplies for children whose families needed extra support before the new school year. It was never glamorous work. We unpacked boxes, counted notebooks, sorted pencils, checked supply lists, and stacked completed backpacks along one wall until the room was filled with neat rows waiting to be distributed. Most volunteers were ordinary people giving up part of their weekend because they believed small acts of kindness mattered. Nobody asked who deserved the most credit. Nobody cared whose name appeared first on a list. Everyone simply worked together until the job was finished. While we were loading the final boxes into a storage room, an older volunteer named Mr. Henderson smiled at me and said something I had heard in different forms many times over the years. I always know things will get done when you are here. I thanked him politely, but this time his words carried a different meaning. They were not praising talent or intelligence. They reflected consistency. People trusted routines they could depend on. As I drove home, I wondered whether Ryan had ever noticed that difference. Trust rarely arrived because someone demanded it. It usually appeared quietly after enough ordinary days convinced people that your actions matched your words. Later that afternoon, Emily and I stopped by my parents' house for iced tea. My mother was trimming rose bushes while my father adjusted the sprinkler system in the front yard. Everything felt comfortably familiar. We sat together beneath the shade of the old maple tree, talking about neighborhood news, upcoming football season, and my aunt's plans for a Labor Day picnic. Eventually, my mother looked toward me with the thoughtful expression she always wore before asking an important question. "Have you spoken with Ryan since your aunt's birthday?" She asked gently. I admitted that I had not. She nodded without surprise. "Neither has anyone else for very long," she replied quietly. "He comes to family dinners, but he leaves early now." My father lowered the newspaper resting across his lap. "Your uncle mentioned that business has become more difficult this year. Ryan has been carrying a lot on his shoulders." I listened carefully without interrupting. My mother continued after a brief pause. "Sometimes people who have always been strong become frightened of looking weak. They stop asking for help because they believe everyone expects them to have every answer." Her words reminded me of our childhood. Ryan had always been the confident one. If a bicycle chain slipped off, he fixed it. If someone became lost during a camping trip, Ryan somehow found the trail again. He naturally stepped forward whenever something needed to be done. Perhaps spending years in that role made it difficult for him to admit uncertainty when life became more complicated. That evening, while Emily and I cleaned the kitchen after dinner, I found myself remembering another moment from years earlier that I had almost forgotten. Shortly after Ryan started his construction company, he proudly showed me the keys to his first office. He had worked incredibly hard to reach that point, and I remember telling him how impressed I was by everything he had accomplished. Instead of celebrating, he unexpectedly asked whether I thought people respected him enough to trust him with bigger projects. At the time, I laughed and told him that respect would naturally come with experience. Looking back, I realized that question had never really disappeared. It had simply followed him through the years, growing quieter but heavier. Emily placed the last clean plate into the cabinet before turning toward me. "You are thinking about him again," she said with a gentle smile. I nodded. I keep remembering little conversations that seemed unimportant back then. She rested both hands on the kitchen counter. That is usually how understanding begins. We stop looking for one dramatic explanation and start noticing all the small pieces we ignored. Her observation felt exactly right. I had spent weeks replaying one painful afternoon, believing the answer must be hidden inside those few uncomfortable minutes. Instead, the truth seemed to be scattered across years of ordinary conversations, passing comments, and quiet insecurities that nobody had recognized while they were happening. As summer slowly approached its end, I became increasingly certain that Ryan had never truly wanted to challenge my reputation. What he wanted was reassurance that his own value had not quietly disappeared while everyone else was looking somewhere else. That realization did not excuse what he had said, but it transformed the way I carried it. For the first time since my aunt's birthday, I no longer felt like someone defending himself against an accusation. I felt like a cousin finally beginning to understand a struggle that had been standing beside him for years without ever finding the right words to ask for help. Labor Day weekend arrived with clear skies and the kind of comfortable weather that always seemed to bring our family together one last time before autumn settled across Ohio. My aunt insisted on hosting another cookout, even though several relatives offered to organize it somewhere else. She believed family traditions should never be interrupted because of one uncomfortable afternoon. "If we stop gathering every time life becomes difficult," she often said, "we will eventually forget how to gather at all." Those words stayed with me as Emily and I pulled into her driveway. The yard looked almost exactly the same as it had during her birthday celebration a few months earlier. Folding tables stood beneath the same maple trees. My uncle was grilling hamburgers while children tossed a football across the lawn. The familiar sights should have made everything feel normal, yet I could sense a quiet caution in the way everyone greeted one another. It was not fear. It was the natural hesitation that follows a misunderstanding no one quite knows how to repair. Ryan arrived a few minutes after we did. He waved politely toward everyone before helping his father unload coolers from the back of his truck. From a distance, he looked tired. There were darker circles beneath his eyes than I remembered, and his shoulders carried the posture of someone who had not truly relaxed in a very long time. For the first time since all of this had begun, I stopped thinking about the words he had spoken at my aunt's birthday and started noticing the person standing behind them. Throughout the afternoon, I watched him almost without realizing I was doing it. Whenever someone asked how business was going, he smiled and replied that everything was fine before quickly changing the subject. When relatives praised one of his recent construction projects, he accepted the compliment with a brief nod but never seemed to believe it himself. Even while laughing with the younger cousins, there was a heaviness in his expression that had not existed years earlier. It reminded me of something my father once told me after a difficult season at work. The people carrying the greatest weight often become experts at pretending their hands are empty. After lunch, my uncle asked several of us to help move folding tables into the garage before an afternoon rainstorm arrived. Ryan and I ended up lifting the same table together without saying much beyond simple instructions about where to carry it. The silence between us no longer felt angry. It felt unfamiliar, as though two people who had once known each other effortlessly were now trying to remember a language they had not spoken in years. When we finished stacking the last table, my uncle thanked us before walking back toward the house. Ryan remained standing beside the open garage door, staring at the shelves filled with old fishing gear, camping equipment, and family keepsakes collected over decades. Without looking directly at me, he quietly said, "Do you remember when we built that wooden toolbox in this garage?" I smiled immediately because I had not thought about that day in years. We could not have been older than 12. My grandfather patiently showed us how to measure each board twice before cutting it, explaining that careful work saved time in the end. Ryan laughed softly. Mine fell apart after a week. Mine lasted almost a month, I answered. For a brief moment, we both laughed the way we used to. Then the silence returned. Before either of us could say anything else, my aunt called everyone inside because the first raindrops had begun tapping against the driveway. That short conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it changed something inside me. I realized the cousin I remembered had never completely disappeared. He had simply become buried beneath responsibilities, disappointments, and fears that nobody else could see. Later that evening, after the rain passed, everyone gathered on the back porch with coffee and slices of homemade apple pie. The conversation drifted toward old family stories. My father told everyone about the time Ryan and I accidentally painted the backyard fence bright blue because we had grabbed the wrong cans from the garage. The entire porch erupted with laughter, including Ryan himself. My aunt wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered how my grandfather had looked at the fence, paused for several seconds, and calmly said that perhaps blue would become the new fashion for fences. Watching Ryan laugh at that memory reminded me that trust inside a family is rarely built through extraordinary achievements. It grows from years of shared mistakes, patient forgiveness, and ordinary moments that slowly become cherished stories. As the evening came to an end, Emily and I walked toward our car beneath a sky filled with fading sunset colors. Before climbing into his truck, Ryan glanced toward me for a brief moment. He did not speak, but he gave a small nod that felt different from the polite gestures we had exchanged over the past several months. It was not an apology, nor was it a request for one. It felt more like an acknowledgement that neither of us wanted this distance to become permanent. During the drive home, Emily looked out the window before quietly saying, "Did you notice that he smiled more today than he has in a long time?" I nodded. I think he remembered who he used to be. She turned toward me with the thoughtful expression I had come to know so well. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe he remembered that he does not have to compete with someone who has been on his side since childhood." Her words settled gently into my thoughts. For months I had been searching for the right response to one painful question. Now I was beginning to understand that the real answer would never be found in another clever sentence. It would only appear when two cousins remembered that they had spent most of their lives building each other up, and that history was far more important than one afternoon that nearly convinced them to forget it. Autumn arrived with cooler mornings, bright orange leaves, and the familiar excitement that always surrounded our town's annual community harvest festival. Every October, local businesses, churches, schools, and volunteer organizations worked together to raise money for families who needed extra support before the holidays. I had helped organize the event for several years, not because anyone asked me to take charge, but because I genuinely enjoyed watching neighbors accomplish something meaningful together. The festival had become one of those traditions that quietly connected people from every part of the community. Volunteers arrived before sunrise to set up booths, local restaurants donated food, musicians performed throughout the afternoon, and children filled the park with laughter. It was never about one person. It was about everyone contributing whatever they could. A week before the festival, I received an unexpected phone call from one of the committee members. A supplier had mistakenly delivered several tents to the wrong location, leaving us short of equipment for the event. Without enough shelter, many outdoor booths would have to be canceled if the weather changed. We spent nearly an hour calling different companies before finally realizing that finding replacements on such short notice would be almost impossible. Then someone quietly suggested contacting Ryan. His construction company regularly rented large commercial tents for work sites and special projects. The room became strangely quiet. Everyone knew Ryan and I were cousins. Some also remembered the uncomfortable moment at my aunt's birthday. Nobody wanted to place either of us in an awkward position. I looked around the table before smiling. "I will call him," I said. "If he can help, he will." On the drive home that evening, I thought about how strange life could be. A few months earlier, I might have hesitated before making that call. Pride would have whispered that someone else should ask him instead. Now the decision felt simple. The festival mattered more than my pride, and if Ryan had the equipment we needed, there was no reason not to ask. I dialed his number after dinner. He answered on the third ring. His voice sounded cautious but polite. After exchanging a few ordinary greetings, I explained the situation. Before I had even finished describing the problem, he interrupted me with a single question. "How many tents do you need?" I glanced down at my notes. 6 large ones if possible. There was only a brief pause before he answered. "I have 8 available. They are yours for the weekend." I thanked him sincerely, but he simply said that there was no need. "Just tell me where and when." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet when I ended the call, I found myself smiling. Emily noticed immediately. "Good news?" she asked. I nodded. He did not ask who else was involved. He did not mention what happened this summer. He only asked how many tents we needed. Emily smiled warmly. Sometimes actions begin repairing things long before conversations do. Early Saturday morning, I arrived at the town park before sunrise. Volunteers were already unloading tables and arranging signs when Ryan's trucks pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out wearing work boots, a baseball cap, and the same calm expression he always wore on construction sites. Without making a speech or drawing attention to himself, he directed his crew as they unloaded every tent we needed. Within 2 hours, the entire festival area had been transformed. Families began arriving shortly afterward, completely unaware that the event they enjoyed had nearly been canceled earlier in the week. Throughout the day, I watched Ryan from a distance whenever our paths crossed. He never mentioned the equipment he had provided. When volunteers thanked him, he simply smiled and told them he was glad to help. At one point, I noticed an elderly couple struggling to carry several heavy boxes toward one of the donation booths. Before anyone else could reach them, Ryan quietly walked over, lifted the boxes into his truck, and drove them across the park without expecting recognition. Later, he repaired a loose display stand for a local school booth using tools he happened to have in his vehicle. Then he helped 2 teenagers whose wagon had lost a wheel while transporting pumpkins for a decorating contest. He moved through the festival solving problems one after another so naturally that most people never even realized he was doing it. Watching him that day reminded me of the boy who had always volunteered to fix broken bicycles, build stronger tree forts, and help anyone who needed an extra pair of hands. Nothing about those qualities had disappeared. They had simply been hidden beneath months of stress and disappointment. Near sunset, one of the newer volunteers approached me while we were collecting donation boxes. "Your cousin seems like a really dependable guy," she said with an appreciative smile. "He has been helping people all day." I looked across the field where Ryan was folding chairs beside several volunteers who clearly enjoyed working with him. "He has always been dependable," I answered honestly. Saying those words felt important because they were completely true. Trust had never belonged to one person. Ryan had earned it in his own way long before anyone ever questioned mine. The festival ended with record donations for local families, but the numbers were not what stayed with me. What I remembered most was seeing my cousin doing what he had always done best whenever nobody was keeping score. On the drive home, Emily reached across the center console and gently squeezed my hand. "Today nobody needed you to explain why people respect you," she said softly. I smiled before looking back at the road. "No," I replied. "Today everyone simply watched respect reveal itself through ordinary actions." For the first time since everything had begun, I felt certain that the answer to our family's struggle had never been hidden inside words alone. It had been waiting patiently inside the quiet choices people made when they believed nobody was paying attention. The Harvest Festival remained in everyone's conversations for weeks after it ended. Neighbors spoke about the record number of donations. The local newspaper published photographs of smiling volunteers, and several businesses pledged additional support for next year's event. Yet the moment that stayed with me had nothing to do with headlines or numbers. It was the image of Ryan quietly helping strangers without asking whether anyone noticed. The more I thought about that day, the more convinced I became that I had been searching for answers in the wrong place. I had focused on one painful conversation while ignoring years of evidence that my cousin was still the same dependable man beneath the weight he had been carrying. One cool October evening, my father called and asked whether I wanted to join him for breakfast the following morning at the small diner where we had eaten together since I was a teenager. We met just after sunrise. The waitress recognized us immediately and poured coffee before we even looked at the menus. My father smiled and thanked her by name, something he always remembered to do. Watching him greet people with the same quiet respect reminded me how many lessons children absorb without realizing it. We ordered pancakes, eggs, and bacon, and for several minutes talked about football, changing leaves, and whether the coming winter would be harsh. Eventually, my father leaned back in the booth and looked at me thoughtfully. "Your uncle stopped by the house yesterday," he said. I looked up. "How is he doing?" "He is worried about Ryan." My father stirred his coffee before continuing. "A large commercial project was canceled a few months ago. Ryan had already hired additional workers because he believed the contract would last through the winter. Losing it cost him much more than money." I listened quietly while my father continued. "Your uncle said Ryan feels responsible for every employee who depends on him. He has been lying awake most nights wondering how to keep everyone working." Suddenly, dozens of little moments from the past several months began fitting together. The tired expression at family gatherings. The way he quickly changed subjects whenever business came up. The heaviness behind his smile. None of it had been about me. I had simply become the closest target for frustrations that were already filling his life. My father looked at me carefully before speaking again. "Pressure changes people. Sometimes it convinces good people that they are falling behind everyone else even when nobody else thinks that." On the drive home, I could not stop thinking about those words. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit the construction supply store where Ryan often picked up materials for his company. I did not know whether I would actually see him there, but something inside me said it was time to stop waiting for the perfect moment. When I arrived, several contractors were loading lumber and tools into their trucks. Near the loading dock, I spotted Ryan reviewing invoices with one of the store managers. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were tense, and the confident energy that had always surrounded him seemed noticeably dimmer. He noticed me before I could decide whether to walk over. For a brief second, I wondered if he might simply wave and leave. Instead, he excused himself from the conversation and walked toward me. "What brings you here?" he asked politely. I smiled. "Honestly, I was hoping to see you." He looked surprised but did not say anything. We walked toward a quieter corner of the parking lot where stacks of lumber blocked most of the noise from passing traffic. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "Thank you for helping with the festival." Ryan shrugged. "It needed to get done. You made sure it did." He looked away before answering. "That is just work." I shook my head gently. "No, that is character." His expression softened slightly, though he still seemed uncomfortable accepting the compliment. After another long pause, he quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. "I almost said no when you called." I looked at him without interrupting. "Not because I wanted the festival to fail," he continued. "I was embarrassed. Business has been rough, and I kept thinking everyone probably assumed I was struggling." I listened carefully, remembering Emily's words from months earlier about people competing for significance instead of success. Ryan took a slow breath before continuing. When everyone praised you at family gatherings, I started hearing something they never actually said. I kept telling myself that they respected you because you always seemed to have everything figured out, while I felt like I was barely keeping things together. His honesty carried far more weight than the accusation he had made during my aunt's birthday. For the first time, I understood the fear hidden beneath his confidence. I smiled gently before answering. Ryan, nobody in our family has ever measured your worth by one difficult season. He laughed quietly, though there was sadness in the sound. I know that now. I just could not believe it back then. We stood there beneath a gray autumn sky, surrounded by trucks, lumber, and the ordinary sounds of people beginning another workday. There was no dramatic apology, no emotional speech, and no perfect ending. There was simply one honest conversation between two cousins who had finally stopped protecting their pride long enough to reveal what had actually been hurting. As I drove home, I realized that trust inside a family does not disappear because someone asks a painful question. It begins healing the moment people become brave enough to answer the question they had really been asking themselves all along. November arrived with crisp mornings, shorter days, and the quiet anticipation that always surrounded Thanksgiving in our family. For as long as I could remember, that holiday had never been about perfect meals or elaborate decorations. It was the one day each year when every branch of our family gathered under the same roof, no matter how busy life had become. My aunt often joked that Thanksgiving worked better than any calendar because nobody dared miss it twice in a row. This year felt different, not because anyone expected another confrontation, but because something had already begun changing after my conversation with Ryan outside the construction supply store. We had not suddenly become inseparable again, yet whenever we crossed paths over the following weeks, there was no longer an invisible wall between us. A brief conversation became a longer one. A polite nod became a genuine smile. Small changes rarely attract attention, but they quietly transform relationships before anyone realizes they are happening. A few days before Thanksgiving, I received another unexpected phone call from Ryan. His voice sounded noticeably lighter than it had for months. "Are you busy Saturday morning?" he asked. I told him I had planned to rake leaves around the house, but could easily do that another day. "Good," he replied. "One of my employees is rebuilding the front porch for an elderly widow whose insurance would not cover the repairs. We could use another pair of hands if you are willing." I accepted immediately. Early Saturday morning, we met outside a modest white farmhouse on the edge of town. The homeowner, Mrs. Eleanor Harris, greeted us with homemade cinnamon rolls and coffee before insisting we take a short break even though we had barely arrived. Ryan laughed and thanked her, explaining that no project ever started without coffee anyway. Watching him interact with her reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. He possessed a quiet kindness that appeared most naturally when he believed nobody expected anything in return. Throughout the morning, we measured boards, carried lumber, installed railings, and replaced weathered steps that had become unsafe after years of harsh winters. Ryan patiently explained each stage of the work to one of his younger employees, encouraging him whenever mistakes happened instead of criticizing him. At lunchtime, Mrs. Harris looked around at the nearly finished porch with tears in her eyes. "I wish I knew how to repay all of you," she said softly. Ryan smiled and gently shook his head. "Just promise us you will enjoy sitting out here next spring." She nodded, unable to say much more. As we packed away our tools later that afternoon, I finally understood something I should have recognized years earlier. Ryan had always measured success differently than I had. I found purpose through community projects and volunteer organizations. He found purpose by building things that allowed other people to feel safe, comfortable, and cared for. Neither path was greater than the other. They simply served different needs. On the drive back into town, we stopped at a small diner for sandwiches before heading home. It was the first time we had eaten together without the rest of the family in several years. Conversation came more easily than I expected. We talked about our children, old camping trips, my father's endless collection of fishing stories, and the fact that both of us now made the same sounds every time we stood up from low chairs. We laughed harder than we had in a long time. Eventually, Ryan grew quieter. He looked out the window for several seconds before speaking. "Do you know what bothered me the most?" he asked. I shook my head. I thought everyone saw you as the person people could always count on. I waited while he searched for the right words. I convinced myself they had stopped seeing me that way. I smiled gently. After watching you today, I cannot imagine anyone thinking that. He looked down at the coffee in front of him. The strange thing is, nobody ever actually said I was less important. I reached that conclusion by myself. His honesty carried none of the defensiveness that had once filled our conversations. It sounded like someone finally describing a burden they had become tired of carrying. I thought back to everything I had witnessed over the previous months. The community festival, the construction site, Mrs. Harris standing on her repaired porch. Every memory pointed toward the same truth. Respect was never a prize with only one winner. Different people earned it in different ways, often without realizing how deeply others appreciated them. Thanksgiving finally arrived beneath clear blue skies and unusually mild weather. Our family gathered once again around my aunt's long dining table. This time the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Not because everyone agreed about everything, but because nobody seemed interested in comparing one person's value with another's. Ryan spent nearly half an hour helping my uncle carve the turkey while I arranged extra chairs for relatives who arrived late. At one point, my younger cousin thanked Ryan for recommending a reliable contractor who had repaired storm damage at her house. A few minutes later, another relative thanked me for helping organize a neighborhood scholarship fundraiser. Nobody compared those moments. They simply appreciated them both. As I looked around the table filled with familiar faces, I realized that trust had never belonged exclusively to me or to Ryan. It had always been woven throughout our family in different forms, carried by people who served one another according to their own gifts. Understanding that truth did not merely heal the distance between two cousins. It reminded all of us that the strongest families are built when everyone recognizes there is more than enough respect to share, and that another person's light never has to diminish your own. Winter returned almost exactly 1 year after my aunt's birthday, bringing the first snowfall that covered rooftops, front yards, and quiet neighborhood streets in a layer of fresh white. Looking out my kitchen window that morning, I found myself thinking about how much had changed without any dramatic announcement. There had been no grand apology in front of the family. Nobody had delivered an emotional speech explaining every misunderstanding. Life had simply offered enough ordinary days for people to show one another who they truly were. In the end, those ordinary days accomplished what one unforgettable afternoon never could. A few weeks before Christmas, my aunt invited everyone to her house for an early holiday dinner because several relatives planned to travel later in the month. As Emily and I walked through the front door carrying homemade cookies, I immediately noticed something different. Ryan was already there, helping my uncle untangle a string of Christmas lights while laughing at his own inability to keep them from becoming one enormous knot. The sound of that laughter caught my attention because I had not heard it in such a long time. It was relaxed, genuine, and completely free from the quiet weight he had carried for so many months. During dinner, conversation moved naturally from one topic to another. My father proudly announced that he had finally beaten everyone at the weekly bowling league after nearly 2 years of finishing somewhere in the middle. My aunt insisted her pumpkin pie was better than any bakery in the county. Emily shared photographs from a recent community fundraiser, while Ryan described one of his employees becoming a first-time homeowner after years of saving. Everyone listened with the same appreciation they had always offered one another before comparison quietly entered our family. At one point, my younger cousin asked Ryan for advice about starting a small home renovation business after college. Ryan spent several minutes explaining the importance of treating every customer honestly, finishing work when promised, and never making commitments he could not keep. As I listened, I realized he was describing trust in exactly the same way I had always understood it. Not as popularity, not as recognition, simply as consistency practiced over many years. Later that evening, after dinner dishes had been cleared away, Ryan stepped onto the back porch where I was standing with a mug of coffee. Snowflakes drifted gently through the light from the porch lamp while the neighborhood remained unusually quiet. He leaned against the wooden railing and looked out across the backyard before speaking. "Do you remember what I asked you at your aunt's birthday?" I smiled slightly. "I do." He nodded slowly. "I have replayed that moment more times than I can count." I waited without interrupting because I sensed he needed to finish the thought in his own way. "Back then," he continued, "I honestly believed respect worked like money. I thought if people gave more of it to someone else, there had to be less left for me. He shook his head with a quiet laugh at himself. I spent so much time measuring what everyone else had that I forgot to notice what was already in my own hands. I looked toward him and smiled. You never lost anyone's trust, Ryan. He looked back at me with calm eyes. No, I almost lost my confidence that I deserved it. Those words settled into the quiet evening like the falling snow around us. They carried none of the defensiveness that had once defined our relationship. They sounded like wisdom earned through difficult months of honest reflection. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a small folded photograph I had found while cleaning a storage box a few days earlier. It showed the two of us standing beside the crooked wooden toolbox we built with our grandfather decades before. The paint was peeling, both of us were covered in sawdust, and neither toolbox looked particularly impressive. Ryan laughed the moment he saw it. We were convinced we could build anything. I nodded. Maybe we still can. He studied the photograph for another moment before carefully slipping it into his wallet. This one is staying with me, he said quietly. We stood there for several more minutes without feeling any need to fill the silence. Some conversations end with powerful speeches. Others end because nothing more needs to be said. By the time Emily and I drove home that night, I realized the question that had once embarrassed me in front of my entire family no longer held any power over my life. Not because I had found a clever response, but because I finally understood what trust actually was. It was never something won in one conversation or lost in one mistake. It was built one promise at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one ordinary decision at a time, until people no longer questioned whether they could depend on you. Looking back now, I no longer think of that uncomfortable afternoon as the day my cousin challenged my character. I think of it as the day our family unknowingly began learning a lesson that all of us needed. Respect is not a limited resource. Another person's integrity does not diminish your own. The people who matter most in your life are not waiting for you to outshine one another. They are hoping you will stand beside one another when life becomes difficult. Ryan and I still tease each other the way we did as children. We still disagree from time to time because cousins who have shared a lifetime together will never think exactly alike. The difference is that neither of us mistakes disagreement for competition anymore. We learned that trust grows strongest where comparison ends, and that families remain united not because everyone receives equal attention, but because everyone chooses to celebrate each other's strengths without fearing they will lose their own. Whenever I remember the question that once silenced an entire backyard, I no longer hear accusation. I hear the beginning of a conversation that eventually reminded two cousins and everyone watching them that the most valuable things in life become greater the more willingly we share them with one another.